Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are on a mission that I think will fundamentally change how you look at a dollar bill, a credit card statement, or even the latest headlines about global instability.
It really will.
We're going to be strapping in for a deep descent into the absolute bedrock of the global financial system.
Right.
The stuff that they definitely do not teach you in high school economics.
No. And maybe the stuff that they deliberately obscure.
Exactly.
Our focus today is to peer beyond those, universally accepted functions of money.
Right. The things we all memorize.
To uncover what our sources define as its crucial hidden purpose, the means of control. And this isn't philosophical speculation. This is a systems analysis. It's about architecture, power, and, mathematical inevitability.
And we are primarily drawing our map today from the extremely detailed and rigorously researched work of Kaoru Yamaguchi and Yoki Yamaguchi in their book, Public Money, the Systems Solution.
It's an incredible piece of work.
It is. They approach this whole topic through the lens of systems dynamics, analyzing how feedback loops and structural design, how they dictate global outcomes. We are going way beyond the simple supply and demand curve to look at the actual wiring diagram of power.
Exactly. Our objective is to connect some extremely diverse concepts. Things like the self-reinforcing, almost magical physics of compound interest.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Then there's the structure of global corporate ownership, and ultimately the existence of what can really only be described as a financial superentity.
A superentity.
One that operates almost entirely outside the visibility of most regulatory structures.
And there is one staggering, undeniable fact that grounds this entire deep dive in reality. It's a figure that serves as the ultimate proof point for the existence of this system of control. We're talking about the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and their historic audit of the Federal Reserve back in 2011.
That audit revealed that between the height of the financial crisis, so December 2007 and July 2010.
Right in the middle of it all.
Yeah. The U.S. Central Bank secretly provided $16 trillion in cumulative loans and emergency assistance to major financial institutions worldwide.
$16 trillion. And that number wasn't volunteered, right? They had to be forced to reveal it.
It was forced out by legislation. It was kept completely secret.
$16 trillion. Let's just pause on that number because the sheer scale of it is it's incomprehensible. To give you some context, our sources carefully note that at the time of that audit, the total U.S. government debt, the debt accumulated since the founding of the nation, was about $14.3 trillion.
That's right. The Fed secretly lent out more money to a select group of banks, a group we will soon identify, than the entire U.S. national debt at the time.
More than the entire national debt.
Consider that the annual budget for the entire U.S. Department of Defense is typically under $1 trillion. This was $16 trillion, loaned secretly to private entities, many of them foreign.
That level of systemic action, that level of concealment, and that level of centralization, it demands that we stop treating money simply as an economic tool. We have to start analyzing it as the primary system of control. And that's our mission today. So let's unpack this and start with the most fundamental concept, the definition of money itself.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this by beginning, where every economic student begins. Money 101. We are taught that money has three essential economic functions, right?
That's the universal teaching. The three standard economic functions are presented as the reason money exists. First, it's a unit of value or account.
It lets us put a price on things.
Right. It allows us to price a car, a coffee, a house in standardized units. Second, it's a means of exchange. It lets you buy those goods and services without having to, say, trade 5 chickens for a plow. It solves that double coincidence of wants.
And the third function is that it's a store of value. You earn it today, you can hold it and use it 6 months from now, provided inflation doesn't eat too much of it.
And that's where the standard economic narrative usually transitions into what the sources call the commodity money fiction.
Commodity money fiction.
Yes. This is the story that human economies started with messy barter, then they naturally evolved to use commodity money, gold, silver, shells, because these things were just more convenient and naturally fulfilled those three functions.
Our sources are extremely critical of this evolutionary narrative. They call it a fiction. So why is this commodity money story considered a fiction by the Yamaguchi analysis?
Because it fundamentally ignores the legal, the political, and the historical foundation of money. The sources explicitly state this fiction was, and I quote, invented by those economists who refused to learn about the legal nature of money from history.
So it's a deliberate omission.
They pin this specifically on neoclassical economists who prioritize abstract mathematical modeling and logical and mathematical beauty over historical reality.
So what's the historical reality then?
The historical reality is that the definition is turned 180 degrees upside down in the textbooks. Money doesn't just emerge from the market naturally. It has to first be created and established as legal tender by a governing authority, a state, a king, a central bank.
Okay, so law comes first.
Only after it has that legal mandate does it begin to perform the three economic functions.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, if I try to pay my tax bill in gold today, the government won't accept it unless it's first converted into the mandated legal tender, the dollar.
Exactly.
So it's the state's mandate, not the metal's intrinsic value, that enforces its utility.
Precisely. The acceptance mechanism is mandated by law, enforced by the state, usually through the obligation you have to pay taxes in that specific currency. But if this historical truth is so clear, why was the focus shifted by thinkers like Adam Smith onto the intrinsic metallic nature of gold and silver?
Why the deliberate obscuration? What's the point of hiding that?
The reason is systemic control. If precious metals or later central bank debt notes serve as money, then the people who control the creation and accumulation of that money can monopolize wealth and exert extraordinary power.
So by getting everyone to focus on the economic functions.
By focusing the public discourse on unit of account, exchange, store of value, the fourth primary function has been, as the sources say, obscured and cleverly hidden since the 18th century.
So the standard textbook definition serves a crucial non-academic function. It distracts us from the reality that money is fundamentally a political tool. The hidden function is control.
It is the political and strategic reality underlying the economic facade, and that obscured function is what we have to now analyze in depth.
Okay, so let's define this fourth function.
Yeah.
The means of control. If money buys goods and services and stores value for the future, what non-economic things does this control function purchase?
It purchases things that shape the human condition, social structure, and political outcomes. It buys non-economic things like influence, status, secrets, political loyalty, and cultural dominance. Money, in its ultimate function, is a mechanism to bypass physical and moral constraints.
And the sources point out that this is kind of intuitively understood across all cultures. They draw on proverbs from all over the globe.
Yes. Whether you look at Japanese wisdom, the end of money is the end of love, suggesting that control over resources dictates even our interpersonal relationships.
Why?
Or Chinese wisdom. Everything can be settled with money, even in hell, implying its power extends beyond the mortal world. Or just the simple English phrase, it's money that talks.
It's universal.
This global wisdom confirms that people understand money is not just a tool for commerce, it's a tool for power.
It has this pervasive quality, this sense of danger. You mentioned the famous quote from Christian sacred writings, Timothy 6.10, stating, "The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil."
And the sources are very careful to clarify this point, which is really essential to understanding their critique. They argue that it is not money itself to be condemned or abhorred.
Right. The tool isn't the problem.
It is the cunning of those who abuse the function of money. The problem isn't the instrument, it's the systematic way the powerful use it to create these control loops.
And this systematic control often works indirectly. Right? It's not just a straight exchange of cash for power. It's about using cash to build a system that then grants power.
Yes.
The historical example of the Church of Rome before the Reformation is the perfect illustration of this indirect systemic control.
Absolutely. The church utilized the doctrine of original sin to impose this deep existential mind control. They convinced the populace that they were born corrupt and required constant atonement.
Okay.
This control mechanism allowed them to extract two things: confessions of people's secrets and payments for indulgences.
And how did that become a function of money?
Well, the systematic extortion of money through indulgences served multiple functions. First, it transferred vast amounts of wealth to the church, enabling the funding of projects like the monumental Basilica of St. Peter.
So the obvious part.
But second, and more importantly for control, the act of confessing sins and exchanging money for absolution created a database of secrets.
Secrets that could be used for political leverage.
Precisely. By acquiring confessions, the darkest secrets, fears, and vulnerabilities of the populace, And even the nobility religious figures could use them for political goals, for manipulation, even as blackmail leverage against powerful secular rulers.
That's chilling.
They weren't just buying paper, they were using the power of money to indirectly acquire and control the human mind and spirit, establishing an overarching political authority.
That is a chilling parallel to modern information systems. It proves that the function of money goes far, far beyond just commerce. It funds the architecture of manipulation.
It's the overarching function. As the Yamaguchi analysis shows in their figure, the fourth function, the means of control, it encompasses and dictates the performance of the three economic functions. It sets the rules of the game.
Okay, so if control is the ultimate purpose, let's move into the modern mechanisms through which this superentity exercises it. Our sources define two primary complementary loops of control. We start with the outer loop, which is centered entirely on debt, and the terrifying power of compound interest.
Right, the outer loop.
The outer loop begins with the debt money system, which relies on fractional reserve banking.
Right.
This is often called the magical money tree because it defies our common sense understanding of lending.
It's a mechanism where money is created through debt. When you take out a loan, the private bank doesn't lend money it already has in its vault. It creates a deposit new money on its balance sheet with a stroke of a pen or now a computer entry.
Okay.
The bank is required to keep only a fraction of that as reserves, leveraging the rest.
So the majority of the money in existence is not created by a government mint or treasury, but by private banks issuing loans.
Exactly. Private bankers perfected the system centuries ago and crucially monopolized it. They then gave it an aura of legitimacy by establishing central banks.
Right.
Our sources argue very strongly that central banks were fundamentally established not to stabilize the economy for the benefit of the average citizen, but to maintain the vested interests of the private banking elite and dominate the economic and political spheres.
And once this debt money system was legitimized, they reconfigured it to be a self-propagating means of domination through the mechanism of compound interest. This is the simple math that ensures money makes more money and solidifies the axiom, the rich get richer.
This mathematical loop is so powerful it has been ethically rejected by almost every major civilization throughout history. We are talking about usury, the charging of interest. The sources highlight the sheer scale of moral objection to this practice.
I find the story of Jesus cleansing the temple so powerful because it highlights the singular moment where he was reportedly overcome with fury, specifically at the sight of bankers and money changers operating greedily within a sacred space.
It wasn't the trade of goods that angered him, it was the financial exploitation. And this historical prohibition is reflected universally. We see Islamic finance still avoiding nominal interest, operating on profit-sharing mechanisms instead.
And the sacred texts are absolutely clear on this.
They are uncompromising. In Buddhism, the Majjhima Nikaya Sutra lists charging interest as an example of wrong livelihood. In Christianity, Leviticus 25.36-37 commands, "Do not take interest or any profit from them." And the Quran, chapter 4, verse 161, condemns the taking of usury. The global wisdom against debt slavery is millennia old.
So if this moral consensus is so strong, how did charging compound interest become the normal, accepted, even celebrated practice globally?
The sources explain this by distinguishing between the original form of interest and the modern anomaly. In the original agrarian form, a farmer borrowing seeds would return seeds plus alpha, the extra amount being a thank you or interest shared with the lender only if the venture was successful and productive.
So interest was a share of actual capital formation or GDP increase. If there was no growth, there was no interest.
Precisely. If the borrower failed or if the economy didn't grow, the lender shared the loss, or at least didn't demand usurious returns. The modern system, however, is an anomaly built for domination.
And what makes the modern system fundamentally different?
Banks now charge interest on loans regardless of whether the borrower's business was productive, whether the economy is growing, or whether that individual even saw a net benefit.
Right.
Our sources point out the absurdity in zero-growth economies, like modern Japan, where banks still demand interest, leading to foreclosures and the systematic transfer of assets from the 99.9% of borrowers to the 0.1% of banking elites.
And the ultimate absurdity is that the lenders demand compound interest on debt money, the vast majority of which was created out of nothing through the fractional reserve system.
It's a system of self-propagating debt where the mechanism of money creation is fundamentally inequitable from the start, and the mechanism of repayment compound interest guarantees systematic domination. The sources conclude that this is mathematically more absurd and inequitable than what we would expect in the famous board game Monopoly.
Wow.
The mechanism isn't for exchange, it is designed purely for control.
That domination mechanism relies entirely on a mathematical concept that our brains simply cannot intuitively grasp: exponential growth. It's the feedback loop. Debt feeds interest, interest feeds more debt. It's a positive, self-reinforcing loop that seems almost magical.
It is the defining mathematical property of the outer loop, whether you are accumulating interest on a savings account or, far more commonly, compounding interest on a debt. The growth model defies common sense, which is why it so frequently traps individuals, companies, and even entire nations.
This is where we need to slow down and really appreciate the counterintuitive behavior of this curve. We can turn to the famous anecdotes used by Professor John D. Sterman at MIT, which the sources mention, to illustrate how deeply we misunderstand exponential growth.
Let's start with the one you mentioned earlier, the famous paper folding problem. Professor Sterman asked his top graduate students at the Sloan School of Management people who are already highly numerate and preparing for leadership roles. A simple question.
Right.
How tall would a standard sheet of paper be if you could fold it over 42 times?
Now, I'll try to put myself in the position of one of those students. We know paper is thin, maybe 1/10 of a millimeter. Folding it once, twice, 3 times, you notice it. But 42 times. I'd probably guess something reasonable, maybe a multi-story building. The Eiffel Tower, as some students guessed, sounds like a very ambitious estimate.
And that's exactly the common sense trap. The estimates from those top students were consistently low. The height of a person, a 3-story building, the Eiffel Tower, the Himalayas, or perhaps the Tokyo Tower, all enormous structures, but grossly underestimating the power of that exponent.
So what's the staggering truth?
The true calculation is startling. Folding a sheet of paper 42 times means its thickness is multiplied by 2 to the power of 42. Assuming the paper is 0.1 millimeters thick, the total thickness is 439,800 kilometers.
Wait. 439,000 kilometers.
Yes, that distance far exceeds the average distance from the Earth to the Moon, which is approximately 380,000 kilometers.
So it reaches the moon.
A simple sheet of paper folded 42 times reaches the moon.
Let's just sit with that for a moment. A simple sheet of paper folded 42 times reaches the moon. That truly explains why the average person, using their intuition, completely misses the danger of a debt that starts small but compounds over time. It shows why this mathematical tool is the perfect instrument for control.
Because the growth rate accelerates beyond human comprehension. Think of the other example used, the lily pond. A lily doubles its size every day, and we know it covers the pond completely on day 30.
The natural question is, when does its presence start to become noticeable? When does it cover just 1% of the pond?
It's completely counterintuitive. It covers 1% of the pond on day 24.
Day 24.
That means for 23 entire days, you would barely notice the lily. Its presence is trivial. But then, in the final 6 days, the disaster hits, and the pond is completely suffocated. That timeline is exactly how financial debt feels to a family or a nation. Silent growth followed by a sudden, overwhelming crisis.
The king in the Iranian folktale about the chessboard and rice also learns this lesson the hard way.
A simple request for a reward. 1 grade of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, doubling across the 64 squares. The king, thinking linearly, agrees immediately, imagining a small bag of rice.
He thinks he got a great deal.
But by the 64th square, the amount required is astronomically large, more rice than has ever been produced in human history. Exponential growth quickly overwhelms expectations, guaranteeing control remains with the person who understands the math.
So if the math is unavoidable, we need a way to quantify this horror. That brings us to the beautiful property of exponential growth, which is that the doubling time is constant.
This is the rule of 69, which provides a simple formula for the listener to understand how quickly wealth or debt can compound. Doubling or halving time is calculated by dividing 69 years by the rate of increase or decrease, expressed as a percentage.
Let's look at some real-world applications of financial horror using the rule of 69.
Take a loan shark or a high-interest credit card operating at a 20% interest rate per annum. Applying the rule of 69, 69 divided by 20 gives you a doubling time of just 3.45 years. Let's round that to 3.5 years.
So a $150,000 debt becomes $300,000 in 3.5 years, then $600,000 in 7 years, and then $1.2 million in just 10.5 years.
An 8-fold increase in just over a decade. And this isn't theoretical. This math was directly applicable to the Greek government's debt crisis when interest rates on its bonds exceeded 20%. The exponential curve made default inevitable.
Now, let's apply it to moderate stable growth. If an economy or a debt grows at 3% per year, which is historically considered healthy, the doubling time is 23 years.
Right.
So in 69 years, that debt or wealth increases eightfold. Over a human lifespan, the gap between the person compounding wealth at 3% and the person compounding debt at 3% becomes immense.
And the formula can be used positively, too. Prime Minister Akita of Japan promised to double the nation's income in the 1960s. He relied on maintaining a 7% annual growth rate. 69 divided by 7 is approximately 10.
A 10-year doubling time.
That meant doubling the national income every 10 years, a promise he fulfilled, leveraging this powerful exponential dynamic.
That kind of intentional high-rate growth quickly compounds the initial capital. Projecting Japan's 1960 GDP of 13.6 trillion yen forward over 50 years to 2010, that is 5 doubling periods or a 32-fold increase, you get 435.2 trillion yen.
Which is remarkably close to the actual nominal GDP of 482 trillion yen in 2010, despite Japan experiencing decades of stagnation post-1990. The underlying power of exponential mathematics to structure control, debt, and wealth is simply undeniable.
And finally, applying the rule of 69 to exponential decay. The environmental cleanup required after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster provides a chilling example.
Cesium-137, a major contaminant, has a half-life of 30 years. Using the rule of 69 for decay, 69 divided by 30 gives us a continuous decrease rate of 2.3% per year.
Okay.
While 30 years seems long, think about reducing the contamination level to just 1% of the original amount.
That requires multiple half-lives.
Yes. It takes about 200 years for the level of cesium-137 contamination to reduce to just 1%. The same math that quickly builds debt or wealth also dictates the glacial pace of environmental recovery. The outer loop of control relies entirely on weaponizing this counterintuitive math against the borrower and the populace.
But the sources suggest this outer loop compound interest enabled by debt money was insufficient for total control. It had to be complemented by the inner loop.
That's right. The banking cartel realized they needed a more direct, more intimate form of control over industry and politics.
If the outer loop is about extracting interest through debt, the inner loop, the equity ownership system, is about extracting the other major forms of unearned income: dividends, rents, capital gains, and control over assets.
Correct. The outer loop gives them massive amounts of capital. The inner loop tells them how to use that capital to exert influence. They utilize the private joint stock company system, where ownership is sliced into exchangeable stocks and shares.
So the accumulated money from the outer loop is used to acquire shares and thereby control the decision-making of corporations.
Exactly. Bankers and financiers accumulate immense capital and use it to become dominant shareholders in key business organizations. Simultaneously, they accumulate vast holdings of land and real estate to collect rents, ensuring they extract wealth regardless of economic activity.
And the sources emphasize that this system requires narrative control to maintain stability.
Absolutely. The system solidifies its grip by simultaneously acquiring and owning media outlets, newspapers, broadcast networks, major publishing houses. This allows them to steer public opinion, frame narratives, and ensure that policies enacted by governments consistently favor the interests of the financial elite.
So it's a feedback loop.
This intertwining of the two loops, debt money and equity ownership, is the ultimate system of control under modern capitalism.
Now, for many listeners, this level of coordination sounds like something straight out of fiction, the dreaded C word. But the sources anchor this claim in rigorous, verifiable scientific research.
They turn to the landmark 2011 study from ETH Zurich, conducted by Stefania Vitali and her colleagues, titled The Network of Global Corporate Control. This wasn't speculative, it was a massive data mining exercise.
Okay.
They analyzed a commercial database of 37 million companies, focusing specifically on 13 million transnational corporations worldwide to map out who controls whom.
They used standard economic metrics to proxy control, looking at the potential influence over the operating revenue of these TNCs. What did the overall network architecture look like?
They found a specific structure known as the bow tie topology. Imagine a bow tie. The largest part is the connected mass, but the crucial knot in the center is the core.
The knot in the middle.
Right. The largest connected component, or LCC, contained 36% of all TNCs and dominated over 94% of all TNC operating revenues. But within that, they identified the key knot, the SCC, or a strongly connected component.
The SCC is the core group of entities that mutually own and control each other. How concentrated is this core?
This is where the data gets astonishing. The SCC core group represents less than 1% of the total network, specifically only 0.7% of all TNCs.
Less than 1%.
Yet, this microscopic fraction dominates 18.7% of the total operating revenues of all transnational corporations globally.
Less than 1% controlling almost 20% of the global corporate revenue. But the concentration numbers get even more extreme when you look at the specific nodes, the individual financial entities at the very top.
They do. The analysis showed an incredible funnel of power. Just 146 nodes, that's only 0.024% of the economic entities they examined, collectively control a staggering 40% of all TNC operating revenues worldwide.
40% of the entire network's revenue controlled by 146 institutions.
And if you expand that list slightly, the top 737 nodes, still only 0.123% of the entire system, collectively control 80% of all TNC operating revenues.
80%.
This is not competition. This is hyper-concentration of ownership.
And the crucial question is, who are these control holders? What sector dominates this inner core?
If you examine the list of the top 25 control holders, the data is unambiguous. They are overwhelmingly dominated by financial institutions. The researchers used NEC industrial sector codes to classify them, specifically codes 65, 66, and 67.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with the NZ classification system, what exactly do codes 65, 66, and 67 represent?
They represent the core financial sector. Code 65 covers financial intermediation, like banks and holding companies. 66 covers insurance and pension funding. And 67 covers auxiliary financial services, like asset management, brokerage, and portfolio management. In short, the top control is held entirely by the global financial services industry.
The power is concentrated in the people who manage the money, not the people who produce the goods.
Precisely. We see names like Barclays, which was ranked #1 and controlled 4% of the network control, followed closely by JP Morgan Chase, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, and Credit Suisse. The top 3 control holders commanded 9% of the network, and the top 10 controlled almost 20%.
And the fact that truly highlights the nature of this system is who is absent from this list.
Right. Major manufacturing giants like General Motors or Toyota, or massive resource extractors like ExxonMobil or BP are nowhere near the top 50 control holders.
They're not in the core.
This confirms the source material's argument. The ultimate system of control is lodged firmly within the international financial sector, the inner loop knot in the productive goods manufacturing economy.
And considering this study was conducted using 2007 data, just before the full force of the financial crisis and the subsequent wave of mergers and bankruptcies, it's highly likely that this concentration has only increased since then.
The authors suggest exactly that. The system has become less competitive, less resilient, and even more hyper-controlled by this tight SCC core group, which fundamentally undermines the notion of a freely competitive global market.
This brings us back full circle to the proof point we started with, the $16 trillion secret. We now know that a tiny group of financial institutions forms the SCC core group. Let's connect that scientific finding directly to the historic GAO audit of the Federal Reserve in 2011.
The audit was a landmark moment because the Fed, citing its independence, had historically resisted all attempts at full external inspection. The audit was only possible due to the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, driven largely by public demand for accountability after the 2008 collapse.
And the revelation was that between December 2007 and July 2010, the Fed secretly made $16 trillion in cumulative emergency loans to approximately 20 major banking institutions under the too big to fail doctrine.
And when our sources cross-reference the list of the banks that received those secret loans with the list of the top 50 global control holders identified by the Zurich study, the convergence was undeniable.
Same list.
11 of the financial institutions bailed out by the Fed were members of that exclusive SCC core group.
So the same entities that the scientific study identified as the most concentrated, interconnected, and controlling segment of the global economy were the exact same entities receiving the largest hidden interest-free lifeline from the U.S. Central Bank.
The list is a roll call of the super entity. Barclays, JP Chase, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and on and on. They were proven to be the most critical, centralized actors, and they were the ones saved by taxpayer-backed guarantees.
What's truly remarkable is that 6 out of those 11 bailed-out SEC core members were non-U.S. banks entities like Barclays, UBS, and Deutsche Bank. Why is the U.S. central bank, whose mandate is ostensibly to stabilize the U.S. economy, bailing out foreign financial entities?
This raises the critical question that defines the system's architecture. Isn't it because these banks, both domestic and foreign, are themselves the shareholders of the Federal Reserve banks?
That structural relationship is the ultimate fox guarding the henhouse metaphor.
Absolutely. We know that the Federal Reserve System is structured as a private-public hybrid. The major loans and market operations are typically conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the FRBNY.
Right.
Thanks to FOIA requests and public disclosures, we know who owns the FRBNY.
And the ownership is incredibly concentrated among the same actors who received the bailouts.
Shockingly so. As of 2018 disclosures, the top 2 shareholders of the FRBNY Citibank holding 42.8% of the shares, and JP Chase Bank holding 29.5% collectively accounted for 72.3% of the bank's total shares.
Over 70%. Just 2 banks.
And other major shareholders include those same global actors, Deutsche Bank Trust, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley.
This moves the conversation entirely away from economic theory and into system design. The banks that control the global corporate network, the SEC core, are also the primary owners of the central bank, the FRBNY, that bails them out when their high-risk activities fail.
The system is not one of free competition, as the textbooks claim. It is structurally distorted, biased fundamentally in favor of this SEC core group. They internalize the profits during good times via the outer loop of debt and interest and the inner loop of equity and dividends.
And they externalize the losses onto the public via the central bank when things go wrong. This SEC core group, the international banking cartel, is therefore acting as a transnational governing force. This is why the sources describe it as an economic superentity.
It acts like a state without territory. The sources use the analogy of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or SMO, which is a non-territorial entity recognized globally as sovereign. It issues its own passports and holds observer status at the UN. The SEC superentity holds massive economic and political power, transcends national borders, and operates outside democratic accountability, making it a de facto sovereign power in the financial realm.
The existence of this superentity, operating covertly and expanding its influence globally, it reminds us of the profound warnings issued by President John F. Kennedy decades ago.
In his 1961 The President and the Press speech, Kennedy spoke not just to foreign threats, but of a system operating internally. He warned against a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that expands its sphere of influence through secret and covert means, utilizing infiltration, subversion, and intimidation instead of overt military force.
And his subsequent focus on transparency becomes acutely relevant when discussing the $16 trillion secret. Kennedy emphasized that the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and he fundamentally opposed secret societies to secret oaths and to secret proceedings.
That historical warning perfectly encapsulates the structure we've detailed. The tactics this superentity employs to maintain control are highly sophisticated, relying fundamentally on the divide and rule strategy.
How does the divide and rule tactic function in the context of global finance?
The fundamental logic is that the financial elite, the SEC core, cooperate among themselves. They avoid fighting each other because fighting results in a net loss to their collective capital. Their priority is the maintenance of their status quo and the expansion of the control loops.
But they need the 99% to fight.
Exactly. They use the control mechanisms, primarily debt money and equity-controlled media, to nurture and dispatch controlled opposition and create groups that fight each other. They finance both sides of political, social, and historically military conflicts, ensuring profits are siphoned off regardless of the winner. They never truly lose because their investments are hedged, and the resulting chaos allows them to advance their agenda of greater centralization and control.
Let's look at the incredible intellectual nugget the sources drop regarding the historical case study of capitalism versus communism, which defined the 20th century. It appeared to be the ultimate conflict of opposing ideologies, right? Yet the international banking cartel reigned and profited throughout.
The sources reveal the surprising point that the structural mechanisms of financial control were embedded in both regimes. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, laid out specific goals for the proletariat.
What specific goals align with the architecture of financial control?
They called for the centralization of credit in the hands of the state, by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. They also called for a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax.
So if the goal is absolute control over wealth, it doesn't matter if that centralized control is achieved by private individuals owning major international banks, which is capitalism's SEC core, or by the privileged elites sitting in the central Politburo, which is communism.
The underlying mechanism, the centralized control of credit and the confiscation of national wealth via public debt, remains identical.
So for international bankers who finance both the czars and the Bolsheviks or the Western powers and the Soviet bloc, the political ideology of the regime is secondary.
As long as the nation operates under the debt money system and the centralized control of credit, the control loops are intact and the suitor entity profits from the chaos.
This analysis leads us to the final crucial takeaway. If the system is structurally designed for control and domination by a hyper-concentrated few, then the massive, interconnected global problems we face are not random events or policy failures. They are the predictable symptoms of this system design failure.
Figure 10.9 in the source material provides a clear map of how the two control loops generate these symptoms. The problems we attempt to solve in isolation are simply interconnected patterns of behavior created by the underlying architecture.
On the economic side, we see issues like booms and depressions, persistent unemployment, crippling inflation, debt crises, and widening income inequality, all generated by the inherent instability and debt mandate of the outer loop system.
Then you look at the social issues, racism, gender discrimination, religious conflicts, even the chaos surrounding public health crises like COVID-19. These are listed as symptoms primarily caused by the inner loop, the equity ownership system, via the divide and rule tactics, which deliberately polarize and create artificial conflict to maintain control.
And the most complex, pervasive issues, environmental degradation, climate change, and geopolitical crises like wars, terrorism, and nuclear conflicts, are exacerbated by the combination of both systems, specifically the political conflict driven by the divide and rule tactic that ensures constant demand for military financing and resource extraction.
The key realization is that incremental policy changes cannot solve these symptoms. We are treating a recurring fever while ignoring the underlying infection. A fundamental systemic solution requires reforming the two underlying control systems, the debt money system and the equity ownership system.
This has been a true deep dive, moving us entirely outside the usual economic paradigm. We started by discarding the simple three-function definition of money to recognize its overarching fourth function, control, which is executed through two dominant and intertwined loops.
The outer loop weaponizes the math of compound interest through the debt money system, generating exponential growth that funnels wealth upward. And the inner loop, the equity ownership system, uses that wealth to establish direct corporate and media control, culminating in the SEC core group, the global banking cartel, which hard data confirms is the de facto economic super entity.
And the proof is in the system design. The $16 trillion in secret loans provided by the Federal Reserve to those exact same financial entities confirms the systemic bias, externalizing their losses and ensuring the lack of free competition at the top. The global issues we face are the painful, predictable symptoms of this financial architecture.
The sources suggest that if we focus on breaking the core mechanism, specifically by eliminating the debt money system, the entire control structure would begin to collapse simultaneously, opening the door for profound systemic reform, moving toward a public money system focused on shared prosperity rather than centralized control.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to consider. If the largest, most entrenched issues we face globally, from economic instability and rampant income inequality to social division and persistent political conflict, are fundamentally system design failures driven by these two interlocking loops of financial control, what kinds of profound social, environmental, and political actions that seem impossible, complicated, or politically blocked today, like comprehensive climate action, universal basic infrastructure, or ending persistent international conflict, would suddenly become achievable and politically viable if the control loops were truly broken and the financial superentity was dismantled.